for years for someone to do this project. It's because people would come to the Santa Barbara Mission Archive. They would look up their family ancestry and they'd be like, why is this person listed as a Pardo here? Pardo is colonial speak for somebody of African descent.
I'm Damian Bacich, and this is the California Frontier Show, where we take deep dives into aspects of California history that you may or may not have learned in school. And one of the things that I consciously try to do on this show is to bring out overlooked or perhaps counterintuitive aspects of California history, especially its early history. And my guest today is Dr. Cameron Jones. And he is going to tell us about an aspect of California history we rarely hear about, California's early African descendants. Now, Cameron is an award-winning author who has multiple publications to his credit. And regarding this topic, he is the co-editor of At the Heart of the Borderlands, which is the first book-length study of Africans and Afro-descendants on the frontiers of the Spanish Empire in the Americas. But in particular, what I wanted him to talk about was an initiative that he started where he teaches at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo, California. He has, along with some other colleagues, started a website called African-Californios.org. And it's a research project based out of Cal Poly's Institute for Advanced Technology and Public Policy. And it's really cool because it uses tools from computing and data science to study the lives of people of African descent who played important roles in California during the Spanish, Mexican, and the early American periods. And if you go on the website, you'll see it has maps with concentrations of people of African descent in California between 1769 and 1850. It's got biographies of a number of Californios of African descent, including probably the most well-known, Pio Pico, who was the last Mexican governor of California. It's got photos, lists of descendants, and it's growing all the time as more data get input to it. So if you're interested in California's Black history, especially in the early years, I'd say it's one of, if not the premier place to go. So with that intro, let's get into the interview with Dr. Cameron Jones. Before we get into the whole subject, it'd be cool if you would tell us a little bit about your background and actually how you got into the subject that we're going to talk about today.
Okay, so I actually started in working on Andean history. Was my PhD was on missionaries, Franciscan missionaries, kind of the same missionaries that came to California, went to the Andes. In basically the eastern Amazonian jungles of Peru, a group called the Missionaries of Santa Rosa de Acopa. So my first book was on these missions in very similar situation to what you have in California, kind of a frontier area. And as I was doing that book, I saw all these people, all these Africans that were popping up, enslaved Africans that were subject to the missions, and maybe it was a little unclear if some of them were free. When I was finishing that up, I was actually here visiting my parents. I actually didn't have the job at Cal Poly. I'm actually from San Luis Obispo. And I thought, oh, there's a mission archive nearby. I'll just go see what there's there. And I had that in the back of my mind. And I started talking to Monica Orozco, who was at the time the archivist there. She now runs the whole mission complex there. She's the executive director, I believe is her official title. And I mentioned, I'm kind of interested. Were there people, blacks or people of African descent in the missions? And she looked at me in the eyes and said, I've been waiting for years for someone to do this project. And I'm like, okay, well then now I'm doing this project. That is how this project goes. So that's kind of a dramatic beginning. Um, and so as I was finishing up my other book, I started to do research on it and kind of shift. It wasn't as big of a shift as I thought it would be because, it's looking at the Franciscan missions here as opposed to Peru, kind of the same guys. They're in the same pipeline coming out of Spain through this institution, kind of apostolic colleges, right? So the one in San Fernando that's over California is similar to the one in Peru. So yeah, started looking at that, and that's how the story started. So then I ended up getting offered a job here at Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo, and I've been here for about 12 years, teaching and writing. So yeah, that's kind of how I got into the current project.
That's it's funny there's some parallels with my story because I came from more literature linguistics side, but I worked on Inca Garcilaso de la Vega and from Peru, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And then when I came to also being from California, when I got my job at San Jose State, one of the first things I did is go to the California room, it's called, there at our library, and asked them if they had anything in Spanish, and came across all of these documents from the 1830s and 40s, and that kind of set me on the path to really work on something that was local and that was tied to our history here in California. So that's really cool, and I think that's one of the things that if we're curious enough about where we are, it can kind of lead you down that path. The other thing you mentioned that I really like is what Monica said, because I was about to say that to you too, is I'm so glad this is a topic that I've wanted to explore on this podcast. And so I'm glad there's finally somebody really digging into it. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's a complicated topic, and it opens up a lot of cans of worms, as as they would say, with just both how the history actually happened and also how it's been perceived over time, right?
Well, what's your starting point? Where did you start, and where is it taking you so far?
Yeah, so my starting point was just there what Monica actually took me to was a questionnaire. It's a well-known questionnaire. It gets answered here in California 1813, 1814. Um, and it's as a result of the Cortes of Cadiz. So the French take over Spain. There's this kind of rump of the Spanish Parliament left in Cadiz, and they write a new constitution. And that constitution grants universal male suffrage throughout the whole empire, with some exceptions. And so the second thing they do is send a survey out, like, well, who did we just give the right to vote? Which they may have thought of, perhaps should have thought of before they did that, but okay. And this questionnaire gets to California, and I started reading it and realizing how much, one, the missionaries actually didn't want to talk about this that much, because the questionnaire was actually very specific. It wanted them to talk about all the castas, the castes, kind of the colonial equivalent of what we would call race now. And the one that really got me was San Luis Obispo, because I'm from San Luis Obispo, and it said that 5 of the 6 soldiers here were mulattoes, people of mixed African ancestry. And so that was my starting point, where I was kind of hooked. I was like, oh, whoa. Growing up here, no one talked about that, right? It was the Spanish, and it was the indigenous population and the conflicts there, but kind of complicating the term we were using for Spanish, right? That most of these guys were not Spanish. Some were, especially the missionaries and some of the soldiers, but I think it's a recognition now that most of the soldiers and most of the settlers are from Mexico, of various kind of racial backgrounds, mestizos, people of mixed indigenous and European descent, mulattoes, and there's even some identified as negros, so blacks, people who are kind of considered full African. I say considered because obviously this is a construction, social construction that is being these titles actually being put on them, but it indicates definitely a more interesting, more kind of multi-racial, maybe multi-ethnic background of what became known as the Californios. So this is kind of where I started out here.
So, can you tell us a little bit about any of those soldiers that you came across?
I mean, yeah. So the original census, I actually still trying to track back, but a lot of these soldiers actually end up becoming the elites in California. So probably the best known would be Santiago Pico, who is comes as a child from his father brings him here. His mother is a mulata, right, a woman of indigenous, or sorry, of African and European descent. And he starts this dynasty, the Pico family, right? And we have Picos everywhere in California. Of course, the most famous being Pio Pico, who becomes the Mexican governor of California, the last Mexican governor of California. His brother Andres is a general that fights the Americans in the Mexican-American War. Uh, um, and you have others, Turbecio Tapia. These guys become big holders of ranchos. They are some of the wealthiest people in California, alongside others that were considered, more or less Spanish. Now, it's interesting. This title, Spanish. Bob Sankiewicz, who you might know, is one of the
Absolutely.
well-known historians. I was had a Zoom meeting with him, just kind of picking his brain about some of this stuff, and he said, to be honest, everybody but the missionaries and the high officers were probably not Españoles, unless they were from Spain, right? Unless they're from someplace in Spain, so the Catalan volunteers, so I think these terms are kind of wishy-washy at times, but nonetheless, yeah, the Picos, the Tapias, these all become really important families that a lot of the current descendants are descended from, and own some of the biggest ranchos around. For example, Pio Pico's cousin, um, his nickname was Tontoy Pico, owned the Piedras Blancas Ranch here in in San Luis Obispo County, which later got bought by George Hearst and became the Hearst property. It's part of the Hearst properties.
Wow.
Yeah, and he actually was almost executed by John C. Fremont um, here in the Plaza of San Luis Obispo for uh, he got he got captured and then paroled, and then he fought again against the Americans, and so for breaking parole, he was going to be hanged. But there's this great dramatic moment where his wife comes and begs for his life, and Fremont frees him. Although there's kind of an implication that Fremont did this for political reasons, like it had been all arranged beforehand that this would happen. Which, if you know anything about Fremont, he was quite good at reading the political situation, and executing the Mexican governor's cousin probably was a bad idea uh, um, politically, right? So
So,
these,
Jade, sorry, just to pause for people who may not be in on everything. So, Charles C. Fremont, the Army officer who came to California originally on a geographic expedition, or at least that was the cover, and then wound up later leading the sort of the Mexican American War effort in California to annex California, right?
yeah,
And
and
later
later
ran for office and ran for governor, if I'm not mistaken, right?
I believe he becomes senator, runs for governor unsuccessfully. I think is the what happened with him. She ran for president at one point as well. So he was quite an active person in the politics of not just California but the United States. Yeah. So these guys are everywhere. Yeah. I talked to you earlier, and this is kind of what I've been really focusing on the last few weeks is the founders of Los Angeles.
Yeah,
Uh,
please.
ha- yeah, half the founders of Los Angeles were identified as either being negros or mulattoes, right? And so, of the 44 people, about 22 of them are of African descent. And
So when
so,
you say, sorry to interrupt, but when you say the founders of Los Angeles, you mean the people that came in 1781?
yeah, so they came on the Rivera expedition. Um, and this had been already arranged by the Spanish government that they would come to this area. Uh, it was interesting. The priest that kind of identified what became Los Angeles as a good area. The reason why is he says, well, there's an indigenous village there, so it must be a good place to live.
Right, which makes sense because they knew there's probably water, food.
Of course, sorry. Of course, the indigenous people probably didn't think very highly of that situation, being forced out of the Tongva village that was there. But so they come in 1781, and they kind of the founding documents November 4th, and they list their casta, this kind of racial designation, and half of them are mulattoes or negros. Now, two of the men who are the only two actually I can find in any California census that were listed as negro as opposed to a mulatto. So somebody who is perceived to be of kind of pure African ancestry as opposed to somebody of mixed African and European ancestry as a
Because
mulatto.
they weren't doing DNA testing
They
at the
were, yeah.
time.
So it's all perception, of
Mm,
course. Um, they later they almost immediately leave Los Angeles, and so this has been kind of one of those California mysteries for a while. In the 1930s, it was said that they were expelled, but some later research by Mason, who's probably one of the best demographers on California, William M. Mason, he looked into it and he's like, actually, these guys asked to leave. They one of them wanted to go back to Mexico. He was a miner there in Sonora and wanted to go back to wherever he was from. And then Luis Quintero ends up in Santa Barbara. His daughters had married some soldiers in the Santa Barbara Presidio. He ends up going up there. He's a tailor by profession, and it's thought that that was a place where he could be a tailor because to fix the soldiers' uniforms. Uh,
sure.
right. And so he becomes an important staple there in Santa Barbara, dies in 1824. So he's there, at least 40 odd years living in Santa Barbara. Um, so it's interesting because you have this kind of perception that they were expelled, um, but that's not necessarily true. And so one of the kind of questions that I'm still trying to ask myself is, right, what effect did race have on these individual standings within early California society? And the answer is somewhat complicated. I don't know if certainly within the Spanish system they couldn't rise to higher ranks, right? They in most cases they weren't officers. There's actually an interesting case with Santiago Pico. If you look at the 1790 Spanish census, of kind of the first and only complete census of Spanish California, uh, his siblings are all listed as mulattoes. He's listed as an Espanol. And it's thought that they did that because they were wanting to make him an officer. He was a non-commissioned officer, and he was a sergeant, right? And they thought, well, we can't list him as a mulatto in the census, so let's list him as an Espanol. And then he actually never ended up getting becoming an officer, which maybe shows some of the limitations we're talking about here. Um, and so, right, but being in California and the Spanish and then later kind of Mexican governments being so desperate for anybody to come up here uh, opens up some opportunities for these guys to especially when ranchos get started handed out with the dissolution of the missions, right? They start taking apart mission lands and handing out those lands. These guys having military service, having lived here, were well placed to get those lands. And so it's kind of a complicated, like, what does this actually mean? My favorite part is at the end of the Mexican period, when it becomes the United States and you have the 1850 census, the United States Census. Pico, for example, is listed as white in the 1850 census. And although he is actually never listed as mulatto in any census, and that has a lot to do with they kind of stopped listing race after a while. Um, you know,
In in Mexico, you mean?
in Mexico, yeah.
Hmm.
The last time they do is 1821. There's an LA census. And they're starting to use more kind of modern racial terms. So colors, right? They'll,
Mm.
they'll say blanco. For mestizo, they start saying rosado, which is pretty hilarious because
Interesting.
rosado, if you don't know, is pink in Spanish.
Mm-hmm,
So it's kind of like they're red, like, Indian red, quote unquote, right?
mm-hmm,
They're red-ish. They're
mm-hmm,
pink,
mm-hmm.
but that's the kind of the last census I can find where race is listed until the United States takes over. But then a lot of these guys get listed as white, and I think part of it is, Pio Pico was pretty dark skinned. You look at a picture of him, whatever you want to say he is, it's kind of one of those other issues. But he's rich, he's powerful, and also the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo guaranteed that all of the formerly Mexican citizens in this, the annexed territory would have, quote, full rights of citizen, in 19 1840s, 1850s United States, that was white. So they get all listed as white in the 1850 census. So, it's kind of a complicated history that I'm trying to figure out, because I think it's important that we uh, think about this, right? Some people are going to be like, "Oh, you're bringing race into it," and I'm like, "Well, yes, but I'm also in a way that maybe even they wouldn't have accepted. But also, I'm trying to reclaim some, Black history, some African descendant history, right? These individuals, why do they hide their race? Well, they hide it because of the inability to climb socially, and so, and the limitations that they were facing, even in a kind of a Wild West place like California.
So, well, I've got two or three questions that come to mind. One, let's dial it all the way back to Sonora, where most of these pobladores came from. It makes me think I don't know if you've dug into that aspect of it, but it makes me think about, what was the population in Sonora that would have sort of a high percentage of African descendants, one would think, or was the number of African descendants that came here in California partially a self-selecting group that didn't reflect the overall population? Have you thought about that at all or
Yeah.
speculated?
So I I've speculated. I thought about it. I'm in contact with some historians down in Mexico that study the demographics of Sonora to try to maybe answer some of these questions. As of yet, I don't have good evidence. Back 2023, I actually was the editor on a book called "At the Heart of the Borderlands," which is actually about this phenomenon of people of African descent tending towards border areas like Sonora, right? California, you got to think of actually as the border of the border, right? Sonora was a borderland. California is like way out there. Uh, I didn't realize this until I actually went to the Archive of the Indies in Spain, and the way they describe California is like, oh yeah, there's this place way out there that there's some people at, right? In the way that they're describing California. Um, but there's this tendency, uh, because in more, government-controlled central areas like Mexico City or even Guadalajara, which was you know, the audiencia capital that it oversaw California. Um, uh, you you have this, these barriers to kind of higher social echelons for any people of color, but particularly people of African descent, right? There was this kind of idea that people of indigenous descent, right, were neophytes. They were new converts, and so they could be made to be good Christians, and therefore, maybe not equal to people of European descent, but could somehow, climb this kind of social hierarchy. But people of African descent, because of their association with slavery, they really made it very difficult. And so there's this movement all throughout Spanish America, which is what the book focused on. From Texas to California to Argentina, people of African descent moving to borderlands as a way of, being able to climb the social hierarchy, right, in a way that they couldn't elsewhere. And so I think that's part of it. Of course, that could also mean they're self-selecting because they're in Sonora, right? And they're like, in fact, they offered them money to go to California. They would pay them for the first little bit. So they're saying, oh, even here, there's probably some prejudice against you. Here's an even more farther place that's even more, wild, and we just need desperate for as they would call themselves, gente de razón, people of reason, meaning
Mm-hmm.
that they were Catholic and spoke Spanish. Essentially,
Mm-hmm.
is how you could define that. We don't care what you look like, as long as you come and you kind of carry the banner of Spain to this far off place. And so, I my guess is this is a little bit of both, right? There were already a large population of people of African descent in these frontier areas. And whether, Sonora is where the Rivera expedition's supposed to launch from. But if you look at the numbers, Sonora is probably the second most common place people are from. Sinaloa is the number one, which is just south of Sonora. So, it's not
Gotcha.
not that far away. It's also just across the Gulf of California from Baja California. So there's, geographically makes sense. And they also had a large African population. The port there, Mazatlan, which is people know because they go on vacation there, was originally called Mazatlan de los Morenos, Mazatlan
Mm.
of the black people,
Mm-hmm.
right? So the name alone tells
That
you
tells
that
you something.
something is going on there.
That's going to do it for part 1 of my interview with Dr. Cameron Jones. I hope you'll come back and listen to the second half, where we get a little further into African descendant families and how they fared in U.S. California. So that'll be coming soon. And again, I hope you'll listen to it. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the California Frontier Show. If you'd like to support the show, the best thing to do is to let other people know about it. If you'd like to support it monetarily, there are a couple ways of doing that. One is by scrolling down in your podcast app to where it says support the show. There you can become a subscriber for as little as $3 a month. And if you want to give a one-time donation, just below you'll see where it says give a one-time donation. Finally, the show is supported by California History Teachers, which is a full year of lessons for 4th grade California history and social studies. You can find out more at www.californiahistoryteachers.com. And if you input the coupon code PODCAST, you'll receive 25% off your monthly or annual subscription. So check it out.